We are continuing with Chapter 6, Attitude Influence of the Manipulated Mind by Denise Wynn. This is video number 2. It was arranged among the experimenters that if a teacher turned to an experimenter for guidance as to whether it was right to go on administering shocks or not, the experimenter would give 4 prods, only progressing from one prod to the next if the first was unsuccessful. The prods were: 1. Please go on. 2. The experiment requires that you continue. 3. It is absolutely essential that you continue. 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. If the subject was still resisting and objecting after the 4th prod, the experiment was to be terminated. If the teacher was still carrying on with the experiment after the point where the learner had lapsed into ominous silence, he was to be instructed, should he seek guidance, to wait 5 seconds for a response from the learner, and, if none was forthcoming, to carry on giving shocks in the same way as if the learner had answered wrongly. The teachers were all told that the shocks would be painful to the learner, but couldn't inflict permanent damage. Before the experiments started, psychiatrists were asked to predict how the teachers would react to the giving of painful electric shocks to a person to whom they could wish no harm, albeit in the interests of science. The psychiatrists confidently predicted that none but the lunatic fringe would go beyond 150 volts, their assumption being that people for the most part are decent and don't willingly inflict hurt where patently undeserved, and that a person makes his own decisions about what he sees as right and wrong and acts on them, regardless of what he is told to do. The predictions, of course, were disastrously inaccurate. They focused on the individual as an autonomous unit, rather than the individual as someone affected by the nature of the situation he finds himself in. Over all the experiments, it was average for 25 out of 40 people to carry on to the end, administering 450-volt shocks to their innocent partner. During the experiments, the teachers who obeyed instructions and carried on with the shocks quite clearly suffered distress, according to Milgram. Tension, sweating, and trembling were pronounced. Quite obviously they were in conflict, yet they didn't do anything to bring themselves relief, so end the tension, i.e. halt the experiment. Milgram commented, there must be a competing drive, tendency, or inhibition which precludes activation of the disobedient response. During interviews after the experiment with the overwrought teachers, Milgram started to get some idea of why they had acted as they did and how they had personally tried to cope with what they were doing. Most couldn't believe that they had been capable of acting as they had. Milgram found that politeness, a wish to keep their promise to help the experimenter, and an embarrassment at backing out all helped to prevent obedient subjects from taking any action to stop the experiment. He also made the following points to further explain their behavior. 1. Adjustments started to take place in the subject's thinking, which served to undermine his resolve to break from authority, reduce the strain he was under, and help keep up his relationship with the experimenter. For instance, he would get immersed in the procedures of the experiment in order to lose sight of the ethical issues, and he would decide he was not responsible for what was happening. He was, after all, just the agent of an external authority. 2. The subject didn't lose his moral sense. It was just that the morality that was uppermost was the need to live up to the expectations of authority, to carry out what he had freely undertaken, or, in short, to keep his word. 3. The subject might start to attribute an impersonal quality to what was going on. The experiment became an entity in itself with an impersonal momentum of its own. The experiment had to go on. At that point, the subject had lost sight of the fact that an experiment is the creation of a man. 4. The subject would see his behavior as part of the honorable pursuit for scientific truth. This helped to justify it. 5. It was common for a subject to alter his perceptions of the learner in order to justify the pain he had inflicted on him. The learner became unworthy, someone who was so stupid he deserved to be shocked. Number 6. Some subjects said that they believed all along that the experiment was wrong, and that in this belief somehow served to satisfy them that ultimately they were right-minded about the whole thing. They didn't see that thought not translated into action as useless as a moral safeguard. Very few of the subjects were unmoved by what they had been required to do during the experiment. Most, during the experiment, registered protests or pleas of some sort. The man might be ill, is this really all right, and yet still carried on. Other experiments on the same theme, but with minor alterations to the procedure, added still more to Milgram's knowledge about the circumstances which led to compliance. Particularly alarming, for instance, was the outcome of one experiment during which the teachers only had to read the word pairs from cards, while someone else, a confederate of the experimenter, did the shock administering. Here, 37 out of 40 teachers went on right to the end of the experiment because they personally were not giving the shocks and could therefore, they felt, absolve themselves from responsibility. Milgram pointed out the terrifying implications of this in a society where modern organizations really have one person doing everything. Someone shuffles the papers while someone else pulls the trigger. The breaking up of labor into small specialized jobs prevents workers from seeing the whole situation in perspective, so each effectively yields to authority by carrying out his own part. Milgram also found that obedience to the commands of the authority, the experimenter, diminished if the victim learner was in the same room as the teacher, and was lowest of all if the teacher was required to place the learner's hand on a shock plate so that he could take the necessary punishment when he made a mistake. Obedience was highest of all if the learner was completely out of sight, but it was still high if he was visible through a glass panel. But most teachers tended to look away as they pressed the switch. If the learner was out of the room, that also served to strengthen the relationship between experimenter and teacher, which the teacher was reluctant to break. The personality of the experimenter had no effect on teacher's actions. He could be aggressive or non-aggressive, and the outcomes were still the same. But what did make a difference was if the experimenter was out of the room, seemingly out of communication with what was going on inside. In those circumstances, teachers were likely to cheat and consistently administer lower voltage shocks than they were supposed to. In experiments where teachers could choose the voltage of shock they wanted to administer, the majority opted for the lowest. These behavior traits told Milgram that the high shock giving in the main experiment did not occur because here seemingly was an environment where hidden sadistic tendencies could allowably come to the fore. And we'll stop it right there, and we'll pick up with video number 3 of chapter 6 in The Manipulated Mind by Denise Swin in the next video. See you then.